Alright guys, welcome back once again to part 4 of how to build a buffet and hut. We're getting closer, things are moving along, and I hope you're getting a lot of information. This build is a really good build, and it's a real fun project, and because of all the detail that I went into it, it just made the videos a little long. So let's continue on where we ended in part 3, and let's get the ball rolling. Okay guys, when it comes to these raised panel doors, we want to go ahead and get some measurements, overall measurements for the doors. I can't go off of the plans on this because, as I said earlier, the plans call for an inset door. I'm going to do a 1/2 inch overlay door. And in order to obtain the measurements, basically, let me get over here, what I'm going to do is, I've got my depth gauge set for a 1/2 inch, and I'm going to make a little mark there, 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 and one at the top. And that is a 1/2 inch all the way around overlay on the frame. And that is the finished measurements. These measurements I'm about to get are the finished measurements of the door's height and width. So what we're looking at here is 10 3/4 by 22. So our door final measurements for the finished door is 10 3/4 wide by 22 inches long. And now, in order to determine the size of the panel as well as everything else, we know that the stiles and rails, the framing for the door, I've already cut these pieces. Before I decided to go with the raised panel doors, I went ahead and I cut the pieces for an inset door, and I cut them a little long, thank goodness, because I decided I wanted to do the 1/2 inch overlay, and I can still use these rails and stiles because they are cut to rough measurements, and there's still plenty to work with. They're 1 3/4 wide, and what we want to do is 2 of the rails, or stiles, 1 3/4, 1 3/4, that's 3.5 inches. So for the width of our door, we're going to take our overall measurement of 10 3/4. We're going to subtract the thickness of the stiles, which is combined the 3.5 inches. It's 1 3/4 for each stile, and what that gives us is 7 1/4. Now, the raised panel bit set, which is the stile, rail, and panel bit set, and you look at, if you decide to do a raised panel, look at your set and see what the depth of the groove is that gets cut in all the way around. On this particular set, it's 3/8 of an inch. So that panel will be sitting into a 3/8 of an inch groove all the way around. So we need to add that 3/8 of an inch on both sides, which is going to be 3/4. 3/8 of an inch and 3/8 of an inch is 3/4. So we're going to add that 3/4 in, and it gives us 8 inches. And that is the finished size of our panel. Now, these are hardwood panels. Wood tends to expand across the grain. So 8 inches is what we want to shoot for, but I may cut it just a slight little bit less than that to give room, so it'll have room to move. Same thing for the 22 inches. We need to subtract 3.5 inches from that. It gives us 18.5 inches. Once again, we need to add in that 3/4, that's 3/8 of an inch and 3/8 of an inch on both ends for to account for the groove. And that gives us a total of 19 1/4. So our overall measurements for our panel is going to be 8 inches by 19 1/4. Now our stiles will be 22 inches long, the measurement of our overall door, 22 inches. The rails themselves, because the bit, let's see if you can see that, the bit cuts this little tenon on the end of the rail so it fits into the stile like so, and that tenon is 3/8 of an inch. So because it goes into the stiles, it is the rails are going to be the same size as our panel, 8 inches. Our stiles are 22 inches, our rails are 8 inches. Okay. The finished look of the door, the raised panel, just to give you an idea, this is a sample cut on some MDF, and it's just a nice profile, and that's going to be the doors, and that fits sort of, to give you an example, like so. So let's get over to the router table, and actually no, first thing we need to do is glue up our panels. I have to cut the oak boards and I have to glue them up to get our panels and everything, and then we'll jump over to the router table and show you a new addition to the router table, the new router fence that I made. We'll get these doors cut up. Alright guys, the one thing that I enjoy is making raised panel doors. I haven't made any raised panel doors in a while. I think the last time I made raised panels, believe it or not, was the hickory chest project. But I recalled from the last time when I made that chest, was my fence just wasn't adequate enough. It didn't have a lot of versatility to it and everything. So I took a few minutes yesterday and decided to rebuild a new fence. I took the ideas that Steve Ramsey put out when he made his router table and fence and everything. I really liked his fence design, so I went ahead and I took those ideas and built my fence. I didn't have any melamine wood, you know, so I went ahead and made mine out of 3/4 inch pine. Later down the road, I'll probably make one a little bit more, you know, nicer looking, should I say. Now, on an off subject, I'm going to tell you, if you see me sweating, it's hot today. It's hot in the shop. And last night I was drawing up plans for a new shop, a larger shop. And the only thing that I was able to draw so far was the air conditioner. Because the new shop is going to have some type of climate control, some air conditioning in here, because it is just brutal. If you see behind me, there's a big window fan, and that kind of, when I open the door to the shop, it circulates the air through, and it's kind of the only way to get a little bit of circulation. And then every once in a while, when it gets too hot, I turn it around to where it actually pulls in some fresh air. Alright, so I'm going to bring the camera down. We're going to look at the router setup and the bit setup for the raised panels. I've got all my parts cut, and I'll give you a little review of the fence, and then we'll get started. Okay guys, when it comes to the fence, I wanted a tall fence for versatility and things that I could do. So my fence stands 8 inches tall. In the top of the fence, I cut a track, a dado, because at some point in time I'm going to get some T-track to put in there, or I may just skin this over with some hardboard or something, and I'll just cut a slot in that hardboard and it'll accept T-nuts or, you know, T-bolts. And the faces here, I've got everything set up, but the faces here, there's 4 screws, similar to like what you saw in Steve Ramsey, and they're adjustable. They slide in and out. And then I've got dust collection in the back that my vacuum goes into. So that's the fence. And like I said, it's all made out of 3/4 inch plywood. This is 1.5 inches. The fence itself is 1.5 inches thick. And I think it's going to do well for me for some adjustability. And I'll take some photos and I'll post photos of the fence on my website. Now, when it comes to routing the rails, we're going to start off with the rails and the rail pieces. There's not a lot of stability when pushing this rail through the router bit. So a couple of things that you can do, one being, get yourself a nice square block, one that you know is square, 90 degrees, okay? And you can put that up against your fence, bring your piece up to it, and that will give you, it'll allow your hands to be away from the bit, and it'll give you a little bit more stability when pushing the rails through. And you know, that's how I did it. Now, if you're familiar with Rockler at all, Rockler sells a jig similar to this, and it's their coping jig. What it entails is there is a solid base with a handle. You have a sacrificial board here that helps to eliminate tear out and everything. And then you have a slidable little board that locks everything in. And there's a strip of sandpaper on here to help grip things. And then of course there's a toggle clamp that holds down your pieces. Well, I didn't want to buy one from Rockler, so I went ahead and made one for my rails. And basically, your rail pieces, the jig goes up against the fence, your rail pieces butt up to the fence, toggle clamp comes down and locks everything in place, and then this sliding block helps additional, you know, support. And it keeps everything nice and square as you're pushing that rail through the bit. So when you're, if you use something similar to this or a sled, and what this is this is 2 pieces of hardboard, 1/8 inch hardboard, glued together. And I'll try to, sorry, you'll have to forgive my camera positioning today. I went ahead and made a makeshift little handle out of walnut. It's contoured for my hand. And it fits me. And of course, you know, toggle clamp. And it's real simple. It's something that you can make. It took me, I'd say about an hour because of, you know, waiting for the glue to dry and everything. And then you just make sure your base is square, and then you can square everything up nicely. This sacrificial board here, if you can see, I've already did some test cuts with it. It can be removed. There's a couple of screws in the bottom. It can be removed to replace that, and you know, as you make subsequent cuts and, you know, different bits and everything. All right, so that's my little jig, and I tell you, it works like a charm. All right, let's talk about this rail bit. Now, when it comes to setting up the bit, one thing that you want to do first is get your height right. And what you're looking for is, and let's see if I can turn it where you can see it. On this rail, the top part of the rail, this little lip here, you want to shoot for about 1/16 of an inch, or, you know, a little thicker. And what that is on your style, when your rail fits into your style, you want a nice flush, you know, joint. And if you shoot for about 1/16 of an inch, you should be fine, but it's not too critical. Now, if you're setting up to use the to cut the rail on the actual router fence and push it through with some kind of support block behind it, then you want to set your bit up accordingly. If you are going to use something similar to a jig, then you want to account for the thickness of that jig's base and raise your bit up to account for that. My bit is already set for the height of with the jig, and once it's set and you get everything, you know, you get that 1/16 of an inch, you run a couple test cuts, and then when you get the test cut that you want, you know, the fit that you want, save that piece because you can use it for future setups. But once it's set up, then what you want to do is go ahead and get yourself a straight edge of some sort. A ruler will work fine. And in the center of this rail bit is a bearing. And what you want to do is, and I've already positioned my fence, so I don't want to move it because it's set up, but you want to take and put that straight edge up against that bearing, and then bring your fence up to it till you have a nice, even transition, and you're right up against that bit, and both sides of your fence are flat and flush with that ruler or straight edge, whatever you decide to use. Make sure it's a nice straight edge. When all those factors come together, then you're ready to go ahead and start cutting your pieces. With a bit this size, you want to, if your router has variable speeds and everything, you want to bring your speed down a little bit. Your speeds for your router are determined by the size of your bits. The larger the bit, the lower the speed. And the smaller the bit, the higher the speed. So if you want a good reference on that, and as far as speed bits and everything, visit Mark Spagnola, thewoodwhisperer.com, and see his video Raising Arizona, where he talks in detail about raised panels, and he builds a couple of doors. It's a good video. Okay, so we're going to start off and we're going to cut all 4 rail pieces, and when that's done, we'll go ahead and set up the style bit. Now the rail pieces on each door, the 2 rail pieces, they get cut on this bit. And then the style bit, all 4 pieces get run through that, because the style bit is what cuts that groove. That accepts the panel on all 4 pieces. So all 4 pieces will get run through that style bit. And setting up the style bit is very simple. Once you have, you know, your rail pieces cut, you can set your bit up with them. So we'll get into that when the time comes. Let's get these rails cut and go from there. I tell you, that jig makes things so much easier and simpler. Like I said before, I used just a square block behind my piece, and which was fine, but you know, a lot of times if you're not holding it just right, you know, up against that fence, it may tend to, the bit may tend to push the piece back if you don't have a tight enough grip, and that just makes it a world of difference. So what we're looking at here is we've got our rail pieces cut. we can go ahead and set up our style bit. Okay guys, I went ahead and put the style bit in the router. Now, the style and rail bits look very, very, very similar to one another. And one thing that I do to keep them separated is on the top of the bit, and I don't know if you can see that, but I wrote a little R for rail and a little S for style, just so I can identify them quickly and not confuse the two. If you haven't used a raised panel bit set before, the first time, or a couple times you use it, you may get confused as to which bit is which. Of course it's labeled inside of its carrying case and everything, but when you get it out on the table and you might have both of them sitting there and it's like, okay, I got to go back and refer to which one's which. So that little S and little R on there really help out. Okay, now on the style cutter bit, you have on the bottom of the bit is the profile cutter, and the profile cutter cuts an opposite of this little profile down at the bottom here. And then you have the groove cutter. And that groove cutter is what you want to be concerned with when you're setting up this bit. You want this groove cutter to be the same height as this tenon that's on your rail piece. So what you can do is go ahead and set your rail piece and then go raise your bit accordingly. Once you have a height that you like the look of, go ahead and run a test cut before cutting into your actual rails. Make sure everything fits nice and flush, and then you're good to go. Similar with the rail bit, the style bit has a bearing, but this bearing is on the top and not in the center. So we're going to do the same thing that we did the last time. We're going to take our straight edge, we're going to put it up on that bearing, and then we're going to bring our fence up to it and get everything nice and aligned. So I'll do that, get everything set up, and we'll get going. Okay guys, now that the frame is done for the doors, we need to go ahead and make the panels, and this is a look at the panel bit. It's a large panel cutter, and there's a bearing at the top, and then you have the raised panel profile of the bit. What we're going to do is get it set up, and then we're going to talk about what you need to do with your fence in order to make sure that you're not cutting too much, trying to take too much away, cut too much at a time, because you could really put yourself in a tricky situation. You want to take little bits and bites off of this. So we'll get this set up, and we'll talk about the setup, and we'll get these panels cut. There's a bearing at the top of this panel bit, and same thing, we're going to put our straight edge up, and we're going to get our fence position, pushed up to that. But before we do that, we want to go ahead and get the panel height set. And I have, this is what the panel will look like. This is just made out of MDF. This is what I use as my setup block for my raised panels. And that's just a sample of the profile of this particular panel. So we'll go ahead and get our position. And that looks good. Okay, once the panel bit height is set, make sure that your router's unplugged on while you're dealing with these bits and changing them out and setting everything up. It only takes a second to be safe. Now, what we want to do is bring our fence up. And get everything lined up. Now from there, this is my final cut position. So what I'm going to do is, because I leave one side of the fence clamped down and it allows me to move the other side, I'm going to put a mark on my table that I can refer back to. This mark is going to be my final cut position. Now from there, I want to go ahead and bring my fence up. So that I'm making shallow cuts on this panel. I don't want to cut this whole profile in one cut. I want to make passes and get to that final position with it being such a big bit. And you just, if you try to take it all in one, you're gonna tear up your piece, and then you're gonna put yourself in a hairy position, you know, safety wise, and it's just not, it's not smart. Just take shallow cuts and work your way back to that final cut. So with that said, make sure that my fence, everything has plenty of clearance for this bit. When all those factors come into play, then I can go ahead and run my piece through. Now I'm not going to cut my panels until I run a test piece through, and I'm gonna run a test cut, make sure everything is where I want it, my height is good and all that stuff, and then if everything checks out, we'll route these panels. Because this is such a large diameter bit, you want to make sure that your router is turned down to its lowest speed. I'm using the Bosch 1617 model, and I have my speed turned all the way down to its lowest setting, because the larger the bit, the slower the RPMs you want on there, and then a steady feed rate. All right. Moment of truth. And so there is our raised panel doors. Sorry about the lighting, but and everything looks nice and flush. The panels look good. Now we're ready for glue up. But before we glue up, we want to go ahead and since I'm staining this piece, anytime you do raised panels, you want to pre-finish your panels before you glue up the frames. I've mentioned that before in earlier videos. It's always important to pre-finish them panels. It's a lot easier, and if you don't, what happens is as those panels expand and contract, you can start to see lines there where you didn't finish in that groove, if that panel happens to contract enough and move and shift, and it really messes up your finish. So pre-finish the panels first. we'll get those done, get some stain on them. I'm going to get them sanded and cleaned up a little bit, and I'll show you what the stain looks like on them, and then we'll get them glued into the doors and get them attached to the case. Alright guys, well, I tell you what, we are almost close to finish. We're rounding the corner right now, and coming in for home. So let's end it here. We'll get started in just a few minutes on the next scene.